Welcome, everyone, and I present Judge McElroy.
Okay, it's my job to welcome everybody and just briefly introduce what we're going to be doing today. We're fortunate to be joined by the team from the District of Massachusetts that runs their restorative justice program. I know many of you are probably more familiar with what restorative justice is and is not than I am. When I was a defense attorney, it was one of those things that I didn't fully understand, and I certainly didn't appreciate that it was something that could be good for my clients. But I've since had the opportunity actually to attend a seminar with Judge Sorokin and Maria, some of the other people from Massachusetts, presented to judges, and I've become a little more informed and a lot more open to the idea of restorative justice. I also was able to allow a defendant in one of my cases to participate in the Massachusetts program because he was held at the Wyatt facility. So we're going to have a good open sort of discussion about restorative justice, and they'll explain to you all the things that it is and what it isn't. And we can talk specifically at some point during this discussion about Rhode Island, what we have, what we don't have, what we can do, what we hope to do. And I'm hoping for a good open discussion. So welcome, Judge Sorokin and your team. And I am going to now mute myself and turn it over to them.
Well, thank you. We're going to do the first part of the presentation as a panel. You'll briefly hear from me, then from Maria Daddiaco, who's a probation officer who runs the restorative justice program that we have. You'll hear from Janet Connors, who has participated and co-facilitates all our restorative justice workshops. And you'll hear from J.C. Anderson, who's someone who's participated in the restorative justice program. You'll hear from Eliana Nuzum from a prosecutor's perspective and Jane Peachy, a defense attorney perspective. So you'll really get a range of views. I'm going to speak very briefly, just a couple little points. The first, restorative justice is really going to has transformed the way I think about criminal cases. It's not about whether someone did it or not. That's the trial, and this has nothing to do with that. This is about what happens when someone admits that they did it or when guilt has been determined. And it's about real accountability. And the best example I can give you is, for those of you, whether you're a defense attorney or prosecutor, I'm sure you've heard the phrase, "I caught a case." Okay, or you've participated in cases where people received a reduction, whether it's your client or the person you were prosecuting, for acceptance of responsibility. And you had to ask yourself, if you were honest, what did that really mean, that they accepted responsibility? It meant they pled guilty, but did they really accept responsibility for what they've done? And how did they manifest itself? And what did they do about that? And for the people who've been harmed by the crime, what did this process offer them? And what did it mean for them? And so restorative justice, because it comes from the people who are participating, rather than, frankly, imposed down from the judge and the process, it's a very different thing. So what I say to people is this: the first thing restorative justice offers, and that's the important word, offers, is an opportunity for victims. It's an opportunity for victims. And when I say victims, I mean people who were legal victims within the meaning of federal law of the particular crime being prosecuted. But it also means people who are victims, what we call surrogate victims, people who are harmed by this kind of crime. So that could be a mom who's or a family member of someone who died of a drug overdose or is struggling with drug addiction. They weren't a victim of this particular defendant's drug distribution, but they are a victim of drug crimes. And so that's who I'm referring to. The same with gun violence. You might not be a victim of this person's possession of a gun, but that doesn't mean you haven't been victimized by gun violence. And of course, the term encompasses, like, many of the people who come before the court who are defendants in a particular criminal case are also victims or surrogate victims of many of these, typically of drug distribution or gun violence. So restorative justice is a way, rather than boxing people. You are just this or just that. It allows people who've been harmed by crime an opportunity to participate in a process that lets them ask questions, lets them get answers to questions, not something that really happens at sentencing usually, lets them engage in a human interaction with other people, which is often healing for many people. It allows them to affect change, and it allows them to be empowered. And all those things are meaningful or can be meaningful to people who've been harmed by crime. And it's an opportunity, one that people can decline, and that's fine. But it's an opportunity that I think we should provide. The second is for defendants. It's an opportunity really to appreciate that what you've done really did harm real people, and to get to sort of have an opportunity to engage with that process in a meaningful way. And the sort of to change your perspective from I caught a case, which is like a random thing, like I was walking down the street and something happened to me, to I did something that I'm responsible for and I'm accountable for. And it's a process that then in some ways begins to enables the person to ask the question, how should I be accountable? And that too is empowering in a positive way. And it's an opportunity for people to begin the process then of thinking about of how to repair what they've done. And it also is a process that enables people who are defendants in cases to begin to appreciate that, like, they might have been a victim or harmed by crime, and they might need to appreciate and understand that, so that before they can get to the place to appreciate that what they've done is wrong and that they've harmed other people, because they may not think they were harmed by what was done to them or what they have done to others. So those are, in a big picture way, what I think it offers defendants and victims. I think there are a couple of different, there are a couple of knee-jerk, what I call knee-jerk reactions. Prosecutors' knee-jerk reactions. This is just a way for defendants to get a lower sentence. My reaction to that is, if you're a prosecutor, why wouldn't you want a person who committed a crime to take responsibility for what they've done? That is what, in part, the process is about. And so if the person takes responsibility, how it should be valued is a hard question. What should be done about it? In Massachusetts, we don't give it any specific value. It's just people do what they do, and they can come before the court and present it. And then it gets evaluated in the context of all the circumstances. And so it seems to me it's something that, as a general proposition, should appeal to prosecutors. And it strikes me it's something that should appeal. Many defense attorneys have the sort of knee-jerk reaction that Judge McElroy referred to. They're like, I don't know if I want to do that. But in fact, it strikes me as something that defense attorneys should be wide open to, because it's an opportunity for their clients to transform themselves, to change the way that their response to what, if they're convicted or if they're pleading guilty to what they've done. And that's a huge opportunity for them in terms of their lives and in terms of their sentence. So a couple quick points. How do we do this? Or how do I do it? I do it what I'm about to say is just me. I have status conferences, offer status conferences in every case where there's an identifiable victim between conviction and sentencing, where I'll explain to those people what the process is and what are the range of things they can ask for. Because I think there's a lot of, they can always ask for prison, and that's fine. I don't need to tell people that, they know that. But there's a lot of other things they can ask for, and it's an opportunity to do that. I've done that in a variety of cases, from fraud cases to a murder case. And uniformly, every victim who's participated in that afterwards has said to me at the end of the conference, which I do on the record with everybody, they really appreciated that I did it. It mattered to them and they thought it was helpful. So that's one thing, but that's not why we're here today. We have a probation program of restorative justice that Maria will tell you about it in a second. That's one way that this can occur. A second way is we have at our court a pilot program that Judge McElroy referred to at Wyatt, where defendants at Wyatt are participating, and we're offering our restorative justice program there. So that's a way people can do it. Third is our probation office is contracted individually with an RJ facilitator in the community, and he's going to do a small, like one cohort program for 8 or 10 people. And that's a way that a probation office could do it. And drawing on that model, the Federal Defender Office in Boston and 1 or 2 individual CJA lawyers in Boston have either using federal defender funds or CJA funds that were approved by the judge, have hired a restorative justice facilitator or run a process for an individual defendant. You could do that you don't have to have one process for one defendant. We typically in our programs here have 3 to 10, and you could do that with CJA funds. It would be very inexpensive, or federal defender funds. I will tell you from my own perspective, lots of defense lawyers come forward with psych reports. I rarely find psych reports deeply persuasive, or rarely find that they move the needle in a big way. Sometimes they're helpful, but I know they're expensive. I was a defense lawyer once, and I remember getting those reports. I also have some understanding of the willingness of various people to write those reports in many cases. And I think it'd be way cheaper to do this, and it would probably be much more effective. So the last thing I'd leave you with before I turn it over to Maria is that in my experience, that there's one word that a number of defendants have said to me at sentencing who've gone through the restorative justice process. And that is this: it was my aha moment. They were different people. They hadn't talked to each other. They were in different circles, but I'm not going to say that's true for everybody. It's not, but it is a really powerful process that gives that just is very humane, and that brings forth a lot of change from people. So I leave you with those thoughts, and I turn it over to Maria, who will explain what our court program is, which is the heart of this.
Thank you, Judge. So my name is Maria Dediaco, and I've been with the Federal Probation Office now for about 13 years. And before that, I was with another state agency. And what I can say is by far the restorative justice work that I've had the honor to do has been the most meaningful and moving work for not just defendants and community members, but also for myself as a criminal justice practitioner. So I'm going to spend some time talking about our specific model, which is certainly not the only model, but it's one that we designed to hopefully meet the needs of our court. And I think what's really unique about it is that you can pick up the model and pop it into another sort of specialty court program that's already up and running. It can be done independently. And what we've done is that we've seen that folks in a variety of different places in a court case's life can also participate, meaning folks that are pre-trial, post-conviction, post-plea, pre-sentence have all participated, and we've had sort of similar positive results. So if you were to Google restorative justice, there are lots of different definitions of what it is and what it isn't. For our purposes, we view restorative justice as a theory of justice that is a victim-centered approach to justice. And it views crime as more than just breaking the law. It views crime as causing a harm, sort of causing a harm and breaking of relationships with self, community, and others. And restorative justice, among other things, talks about that the best way to really repair that harm is, no offense to present company, but not with judges and attorneys and probation officers, but with those that are most impacted by the harm. And that is the harm doer, the folks that have been impacted by harm, victims, survivors, or impacted peoples, and the communities around those folks. And that when you bring those most important parties together to process the harm, talk about what happened, how it happened, who's responsible for repairing the harms that have been caused, how are those harms going to be repaired, that will get us as close to justice as possible. That the result of that work, this deep, hard, meaningful, restorative work, gets all of those stakeholders to a place that feels more like justice than our traditional system offers. Our program has 4 separate parts. There are 2 parts that are required if you choose to participate in the restorative justice program. So if you sign up for our program or you agree to do it, you're essentially agreeing or committing to do the first 2 parts. The first part is about an hour or 2-hour introductory meeting with myself or another restorative justice coordinator in our program. You'll hear from Eliana, and we have Jamie Herbert also from our office, and we have a few others in the pipeline that are coming up and training with us. And basically, we give participants or defendants sort of a RJ crash course, a 101 on RJ. We talk about things like viewing crime as harm, thinking about the idea of there are no victimless crimes, thinking about the ripple effects of one's behaviors and actions, and also it sort of creating space for folks to think about harms that have been caused to them too by systems, others. And we're also doing a needs assessment during that meeting to see if there are any barriers to folks' participation in our program, and also paying attention to anything that's specific about that particular client that we could hopefully match up for our next parts. So for example, if we are doing an intro meeting with an individual who talks about really wanting to reconnect with their children, or that's sort of an important piece in their plan, we may later match them up or invite someone who is, running a fatherhood program or a parenting program for our next parts. So we try to be really mindful about matching folks as much as possible to people in the community that may, have a connection with them in some way or another. The second part is an intensive restorative justice circle. Our processes are all based in Native American and Indigenous teachings, and that is very much how our 16-hour workshop is run. I see that attorney Bob Watt is on here, and maybe later he'll share a little bit about his experience in our circle. He participated in one, and I won't talk too much about it because I think it's best for you to hear about it from JC and Janet, who we're very honored to have here today. But essentially, it's a super powerful 16-hour intensive experiential circle process. We're doing a lot of the restorative work, really digging deep into concepts of accountability. What's the difference between accepting responsibility and accountability? What does accountability mean to you? What does that look like in your life? Thinking about more about the harms that have been caused to individuals and to others. And then also thinking about how can we move forward, and what does repairing or making amends look like for us? In this circle, we bring together not just responsible parties, but also victims and survivors and community members that have been impacted by harm, as well as we sprinkle in some legal professionals and try to really focus on the roots and the causes of what's happened, who's been harmed, whose responsibility is it to address those harms, and how can that be done? And thereafter, folks get to decide. They've essentially completed our restorative justice program, and we check off the box, they're done. But if they choose to, they can voluntarily agree to continue on to the next two parts. Now, no one's really banging down the door of probation officers and saying, please let me do more, let me volunteer for extra stuff. But one thing about our program is that folks that go through the first two parts, more than 80% of people choose and want to continue. So for us, that's meaningful. The next two parts are a little bit more individualized. So the third part is either folks get to participate in a 6 to 8 week reading group. It's a smaller circle-based group where we used a different text, and it's trauma focused, and we're using the circle process to unpack. We call it a reading group to unpack some of the text materials, or folks can do some individual readings and reflections. We've also had folks watch some documentaries and do some voice recordings. So it's just an opportunity for people to do some additional self-reflection and sort of self-inventory. And all of this leads up to the fourth part, which is an individual restorative meeting with the responsible party and an individual that they identify as someone that they've harmed or a surrogate victim. So for example, as Judge Sorokin mentioned, we might pair up an individual who was trafficking in fentanyl with a parent who lost a child to a fentanyl overdose. Even though their cases are not connected, they still have this shared experience that does connect them, and it can be very, very powerful. Or someone who, was trafficking in firearms, and we might pair them up with a parent who's lost a child to gun violence. Again, that connection that they have is not specific, but it's enough to create a relationship between these folks that they have this shared experience from two very different points of perspectives. And our hope is that in 5, 10, even 15 years from now, when folks kind of are faced with a difficult decision in their lives again, and maybe they forget the judge or the attorney or the probation officer, or even the time they did in a prison, that they remember this very unique experience they had sitting across from a mother who lost a child, or their own wife, or their own child, and had this deep experiential discussion and dialogue with them about what they did and why they did it and who it harmed, and made promises around not doing those things again or not causing more harm, that they'll be able to draw on that unique experience and make a different decision next time. So with that, I'll pause. There's much, much more and lots of stuff I left out, but I'm sure we'll get to it, and I'm always open to answering questions. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Janet Connors, who really needs no introduction in the restorative justice world. She's a longtime restorative justice practitioner and has been integral really in the work that we've done. Janet?
Thank you, Maria. Hello, everybody. I came to this work about 21 years ago, 22 years ago, January 31st. My then 19-year-old son, Joel, was murdered. And I had known about restorative justice in the past, but I felt like people in the system were too entrenched in their roles and nobody wanted to give that up. And there were some complications about it, people admitting guilt and all of that, the ways that it didn't quite mesh with our criminal justice system. I never thought my son was going to be killed. I worked with kids and families on a street called Bowdoin Street in Dorchester, Massachusetts, which is one of 5 identified so-called hot zones by law enforcement. And I saw a lot of kids. I worked there during the 80s and 90s when Boston's homicide rate was at its peak. And I went to a lot of funerals of kids in programs, of friends of mine who lost their sons, of friends of my children's who had been killed. And I also saw a lot of young people grow up and do really well. And I also saw a lot of young people going in and out of lockup and knowing this isn't doing any good. This isn't doing any good. Kids are coming out a little bit tougher, a little bit harder, sometimes almost like having a notch in their belt, sometimes more experienced and schooled in criminal craft. When Joel was killed, I just really, I had to ask myself, what is justice going to mean to me? Before the arrests were made, we knew there was more than one person. We knew there was several people. There was a home invasion in his apartment. And I wrote in my journal, who are these monsters? Because my son was stabbed in his heart. They had shredded my boy's heart. And a couple of days later, I was rereading my journal and I wrote, "We're not looking for monsters. We're looking for other young people. And if I think of them as monsters, then I absolve them of their responsibility. I let them off the hook. It's when I hold them in their humanity that I hold them accountable." When the arrests were made, there were 4 young people involved with it. So I was also really struck, as someone who worked with children and families all my life, really struck by the waste of 5 young people's lives. And I had to ask myself a restorative question, which is like, where have we failed our young people? Where have we, as parents, as neighbors, as educators, as social service workers, as therapists, as counselors, as all of it, where have we failed our young people that they get to a point where they kill one another? And when we went to trial, the results were, first of all, going to trial was a horrible experience. It was re-traumatizing for us. We felt like we were in a theater, in a game, and that the best actor was going to win. There were plea arrangements made where 2 young men pleaded guilty to manslaughter in exchange for testimony. And 1 refused to testify but pleaded guilty to murder in the 2nd degree. And the 4th young man, who actually killed Joel, went to trial and beat his case. So those young men who got manslaughter got 8 to 10 years and 10 to 12. And the other one just wrapped up a 20 to life sentence at MCI Norfolk. He just got paroled in August. And the young man who killed Joel has gone on to be rearrested several times for violent crimes. And in fact, I was contacted last year by his then ex-wife, who had been beaten severely by him several times. Anyway, and that she was one of 4 partners he had had since Joel was killed, who had been beaten by him severely several times. So I decided that I wanted to meet with those 2 young men first, who had the 10 to 12 and 8 to 10, because they were coming back out to community. And as huge as my individual losses, and many survivors feel this way or come to feel this way, as huge as our individual losses, the loss to community is even greater. Every time one of our young people gets killed, deported, incarcerated, there's a hole left in the fabric of our communities. And so I petitioned the state of Massachusetts to have what was called a victim offender dialogue. I prefer to call it a restorative dialogue. And a man named John Wilson from a place called Just Alternatives in Brooklyn, Maine, facilitated my first dialogue. So over the course of some time, preparation time, I met with those 2 young men. They've both stood on my son's grave with me, asked them to do what they need to do to stay sober and work their programs to cause no more harm to themselves, family, and community, to talk to young people around the way. I have since met with the young man who was recently paroled. I met with him inside MCI Norfolk, where I was doing restorative justice work as well. So that to me was when that acquittal came in, I remember standing in the hallway of the courthouse and screaming, like from the belly of my soul, "He got away with murder. He got away with murder." And knowing in that moment that I was going to have to make my own justice. I've since come to know nobody gets away with murder. and that someday he'll be judged by a power higher than any court in this nation. And I also know that it eats his soul up. If I could meet with him, I would, but he has refused to do so. This sent me on a course that built on other work that I'd done in my life, but to just be a restorative justice practitioner. I worked at the Lewis Brown Peace Institute in Dorchester, which is was started by another survivor of homicide victim. Her son was killed on his way to a Teens Against Gang Violence Christmas party about 30 years ago. And she started this institution in his name. And I worked there and was doing some part-time work in schools, restorative justice work. And when the grant was done that I was working on at the Peace Institute, I decided I'm just going to do this. And so I've been doing it. I've done this work in juvenile justice. I've done this work in schools. I train a lot of school personnel. And done this work. It was part of setting up the restorative justice program at MCI Norfolk Prison. And myself and other survivors, particularly from an organization called Legacy Lives On, sit in circle with men and women who have committed violent crimes, including homicide. And every one of us will say, never did we think that would be the case, that we'd be sitting in a circle across the room from people who had killed somebody else. And yet it's a healing experience for us, and it's a healing experience for them. Sitting in circle, you hear stories, you hear the backstory. This was true when I worked in juvenile justice too, to hear the backstory to creates understanding and empathy. That is so lacking in our world today and so much needed. And I do the work with the RISE program. I think that I've done every one except two. I think I've missed two in all the years since the beginning. So I've co-facilitated the 2-day workshop with Maria or Jamie and Liana and Jane. So I have found that work to be really, really important. I found all of the restorative justice work I do to be really, really important, really, really rewarding as a victim, as a survivor, as a practitioner. The RISE program, I witnessed transformation so many times. When Judge Sorokin talked about catching a case, we talk about that. We was like, okay, this didn't like fall out of the sky. No, you didn't catch this case out of the sky. You created this case. You made your case. You made the circumstances that got you this case. And we really talk about that. When people talk, I remember the first time I heard somebody at MCI Norfolk sitting in a circle saying, I was a drug dealer, so mine was a victimless crime. I was like, what? Yours is a victimless crime? And so we talk about that, and we talk about, that whole notion of, well, if I wasn't selling to them, then somebody else would be. So yeah, so what? So why do you want to be the person who does that? Why do you want to be the person who contributes to that? If you follow that gun, if you follow that dope, how many people get killed? How many people get hurt and maimed? How many people get arrested? How many people get deported? How many people get incarcerated? How many people get addicted? How many people die of overdoses? How many families suffer behind all this? Now, can you really still tell me that you have committed a victimless crime? And as I don't remember if it was Maria or Judge Sorokin said, there is this aha moment, and people realize they have many victims, some of who they don't know. They also realized my son was selling weed. So they also realized that they could be my son, that they could be dead. just like my son. So it just brings about an understanding that is so much deeper than just doing a punishment. In schools, I see kids never owning their accountability too. So they do their suspension. In prisons, people spend 30, 40 years in prison, sometimes and never, ever, ever, ever own their accountability. They just do their time. The kids just do their suspension. But meanwhile, nothing is settled. In schools, things have escalated while someone's out on a 5-day suspension. Things have escalated for the young person who was harmed between the streets and social media, and nothing's been resolved. There's a difference to me when I think about the difference between punishment and accountability, and I say this all the time, but I really feel like it is the truth, is that punishment comes down upon you. It's imposed by somebody else. You have no stake in it. You have no say in it. You just take it and do it. But accountability rises up from the heart and soul. It's really, really, really hard to take accountability, to admit responsibility, to admit that you caused harm. And in these circles, we see that everybody has value to contribute. And we help people to realize, and not we as individuals, but the circle itself, the restorative process itself, helps people to realize that they have value to contribute, that they can belong to something that's greater than themselves, that they can belong to a community and be good members in a community. And so I guess that's really it for me. I believe in this process. I love the RISE program. I absolutely, really, really look forward to it every single time I do it. Myself and some other members of Legacy Lives On come in as survivors, and also someone who has lost someone to an overdose or addiction comes and is part of our circles usually. And so when people who have caused the harm have to sit face to face with, in a circle of interconnection and connection, there's something happens inside their hearts and souls. Something happens that wouldn't happen sitting inside a jail cell. And I always ask myself, actually, I have never been able to sort out the contradiction of saying that we are a civilized society who puts people in cages. I know, and two of the young men that I met with said that being incarcerated had saved their lives. So I do know that sometimes people need to be taken out of the fray, but I do know that in a cage and maltreatment that happens in prisons is not a way to return people back to family and communities in a good way. I do believe that instead of prisons, we could have houses of healing. I do believe that there is a way to look at all of this through a restorative lens. And I truly believe in these processes, and I will be doing this work until I can't do it no more. And with that, I'm not sure who I pass it on to, but I thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Janet. As always, thank you for all your work and your willingness to share and your wisdom. So next we're going to turn to JC Anderson. You got to unmute, JC.
Hello. Hello, my name is JC Anderson. I'm a participant of the Restorative Justice. And it started with me growing. I was born in Boston and moved to Brockton. And I'm gonna be totally honest with everybody that's involved. I was that person. Um, I was 18 and got incarcerated for 46 months for possession of a firearm. And during that incarceration, that I didn't do nothing. I wasn't offered nothing. I minded my business, did my time, lifted weights, played sports, and came home. Came home, did my probation, got a little job, got off probation, and I started hanging back with some of the people that I was incarcerated with. Next thing you know, I'm back in trouble. I get sentenced for 120 months for possession of crack cocaine. As I'm doing that 120 months, the same things in jail is going on. People are coming and going. People are happy that they're coming back, but nothing's being given to us. They say school, we go down and read, but it's a meeting place. We meet at to lift weights, stay in shape, talk about what we can do outside and how much we miss our kids. But do we really miss our kids? So after the 120 months, I get out. I understand that I miss my kids and I want change, but I can't offer nothing. So I get involved with hanging with the same type of people and I get incarcerated again. And I'm blaming everybody. It's not my fault. It's this person's fault. It's this person's fault. Then I was told about this restorative justice. And I knew I wanted to change. I lost a lot of people to murder, to incarcerations in my life, friends, family members. So when I got involved with the restorative justice, it became a me situation. I put myself in them situations for these things to happen. It wasn't nobody's fault but me. So I had to turn the mirror around and look at me and deal with what's going on. And even though at a young age I was dealing with trauma, losing like my brother, my best friend, to a homicide, I was dealing with trauma that I was inflicting on other people. And I got to realize how much trauma I was involved with. And sitting in that circle, something hit me that it wasn't a color barrier. It wasn't a me against you thing. It was something that everybody in there was dealing with. And how can I help that person help me? And restorative justice came and identified with that not only me, but let my story help somebody, but mean it when you say it. And I got to sit down with some great people. I shed tears for people that I never thought in my life that I would shed a tear for because of their situation and how they identified crime or how they dealt with crime, how I dealt with crime, how it was affecting, my community. And who am I to not help my community? Why would I bring my community down somewhere where I'm growing up, where there's young babies being raised? And this was all during restorative justice that I realized that I had to deal with me. And the worst person that I hurt in this whole situation and things that I was going through was the ones I told I loved every day. I realized that I didn't love them because I was willing to commit these actions that put them at jeopardy, dealing with maybe somebody kicking down my door, hurting me for something, to me going out there giving somebody something to hurt them or put them in the line of getting hurt. So restorative justice helped me dig deep into me and let me get the knowledge to help my family, my kids that's growing up in this world, to help my wife deal with the relationship aspect of, not only did I go to jail, but she went because she had to be there for me. To the people I met in here, from the probation officers to the district attorneys, that I really want to change my life. And they gave me the tools to change, but I had to take the tools and work them. And it's been working for me every day, that now that I'm, at this point and still got a long way to go, I work with addiction people every day. Ladies, pregnant women dealing with addiction, to men dealing with addiction. So it gives me that help sensation that restorative justice came to let me be able to deal with these people, these addicted, these people that's in crime or whatever I need to do, that someone calls me and asks me for restorative justice, can I help? I'm always willing, because I was there. I was the one that went through prison that didn't learn nothing. It took me to get out and get offered a program that I could see myself.
Looks like we lost JC, but I'm sure he'll be back on.
Let's give him a moment. While waiting, Eliana, do you want to jump in? And then if he comes back, if we get him back, we'll pause and he'll finish up, unless Nora, you see him coming back.
I'll let you know if I see him, Judge.
Why don't you go ahead? And if he comes back, Nora, interrupt us.
Happy to cede my time to JC. Hi, everyone. I'm Eliana Newsom. I am an AUSA in the District of Massachusetts. I am relatively new to restorative justice. I first attended a workshop 2 years ago. Oh, I see him.
You're back, JC.
He's back.
Oh, perfect. Can you hear me, JC? You're muted.
Hello.
Go ahead. We lost you for a second. You cut
Yeah,
out.
but it helped me deal with the whole situation of pointing the finger back at myself to be able to help others and identifying what was going on in my life and the trauma that I dealt with and the prison sentence that I didn't feel helped me till now. And that's what's given me the strength and identity to be able to live the life that my family needs me to do, my community needs me to do, and do for the others that are in higher power in the system or whatever, to know that this can work. This can be something. And I totally agree with the things that I learned and the tools that I accepted to help make our communities better, the communities that I'm involved with and the people that I deal with daily.
Thank you, JC. That's great. Really appreciate your willingness to speak.
Thank you.
And Eliana, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Eliana Newsom, AUSA in Boston. I first got involved in restorative justice about 2 years ago after listening to a district court program that we had, where I learned, from a panel like this about what was going on, and I was immediately drawn to it, and I wanted to find out how I could get involved. And that opportunity presented itself shortly after that, and I jumped at it. So since then, it took me about a year to get trained, and then in the past year, I've started co-facilitating these workshop circles and individual conferences and the trauma discussion group that you heard Maria talk about a little earlier. So I really love this work. I think it's really important and really impactful. I've seen it have a transformative effect in people's lives. You do hear some resistance sometimes from some prosecutors to the concept, the idea that maybe this is just a way for defendants to get out of jail. But I really see this public safety purpose in it, this rehabilitative purpose in what we're doing with the defendants, as well as this really healing process for victims. And I feel like those are such key parts of our job as prosecutors. So that is why I think it aligns very well with our mission. I won't spend a lot of time because I know we don't have a lot of time, but what I've really appreciated about the restorative justice program is how it humanizes everybody in this criminal justice system, from defendants, offenders, victims, the members of the courthouse family. It helps everybody to really see each other as human beings, which we are. A lot of times defendants come into the program and they see themselves as victims. They see themselves as the person that people have been doing bad things to, and they're angry about it. But then when they sit in a circle with a prosecutor who also has children, who also has strained relationships with family members, who's also sharing deeply about their experiences, all of a sudden they realize, no, that is not the bloodthirsty prosecutor who's out to get me. That's a human being. And then they have to turn that mirror to themselves, as JC was talking about. Likewise, a victim might come in and wonder who these monsters are that they're sitting with. And as Janet talked about, seeing these people in their humanity, you can no longer think of them as monsters. So it's a very healing, transformative process for everybody involved. I know for me, I take it, it transfers, the experience transfers in the rest of my work. It changes the way I think about sentencing. It certainly changes the way I talk about a defendant in a sentencing memo. And I think that's all really important, recognizing the humanity of everyone in the process and encouraging everybody to be the best version of their core self. So I will leave it at that. And I think I'm passing it to Jane. Is that right, Judge Sorokin?
I think that's right. So my name is Jane Peachy, and I'm at the Federal Defender Office in Boston. I've been there for 12 years. And I think Maria was talking about how sometimes our federal criminal legal system leaves you feeling unsatisfied, and that the results, I think, as we all know, can be sometimes very harsh, and that feels unsatisfying to everyone, and sometimes like it's doing more harm than good to everybody. And what I like about restorative justice is that it just feels so real and genuine. It's completely removed from our legal system. Everyone's sitting at the same level in a circle. Everyone's treated as equals. I know it might sound a little bit to some defense attorneys that it's about emphasizing to our clients that they're the harm doers, that they're the bad actors, where they're going to plead guilty, basically. And people who are open to change, I think, is the other thing. So you have to have the right client. Like I said, it's not for everybody, but as someone who's practiced both in state court and federal court, and I'm sure a lot of you have as well, a lot of times in federal court, it feels kind of hopeless from the defense perspective. And it feels like there's not a lot, sometimes it feels like there's not a lot you can do to help your client in this, in the face of a federal prosecution. But this program is something that they can do, that you can offer them, that's really real. And the benefits, if it isn't kind of already obvious from what everyone's saying, go well beyond the number of months of incarceration that they might get in their sentence. It really does change people completely, and helps them live more fulfilling and happy lives. So that's all from me for now.
Thank you, Jane. So just to wrap it up, I think one thing for all of you to think about is that what this really is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for empowerment of change and accountability for the defendant, for healing, for everybody really involved. And it's had tremendous effect, I think, in a positive way on people's lives. I'll tell you that there's a mom, another person who participates with Janet, who told me that I talked to her after she went to the first circle and her son had died of a drug overdose. And she said, my daughter is home in a dark place in a room because her older brother's dead. And I came to this thinking I was going to meet with monsters. And she left unhappy with what these men who were there who were convicted of drug dealing had done. But she said, I have a different understanding of that. And most importantly, I have something to take home to my daughter to help her. And I thought that's like, you know what, right there, that's a real accomplishment for us. And there's more. And so I think that it's real lot of opportunity in terms of whatever lens, whether it's a public safety lens you want to put it on or a transformative lens. And I think it's, so I urge you all to think about it, take this, and I'll turn it over now, I think, to John, who's going to moderate the second panel.
Thank you, Judge, and thank you to your entire team. Powerful stuff. Tough act to follow. But what my role here is, for those of you who don't know me, John Marshall, Chief Probation Officer here in the District of Rhode Island. My role here is to just update folks about what we are doing here in Rhode Island in terms of restorative justice, and then taking advantage of having Massachusetts with us and having such a diverse group in terms of, you know, judges, defense, prosecutors, probation officers, to just facilitate and kick off a conversation about what our questions are, what our concerns are about doing a program, or what our hopes are to do a program, but just to start that conversation. But with that, you know, our district's belief to date has been that restorative justice fits better into pretrial pre-sentence phase versus post-conviction phase. We certainly believe in all of its merits, but that should give you a little backdrop when I talk about what we're doing, because it's more focused on the front end. And certainly in our post-conviction supervision practices, we have not tied restorative justice into that. But what we have done on that end of it, on that end of the spectrum, is we have a reentry court, Hope Court, which many of you are familiar with, and that has elements of restorative justice baked into the bones of the program. Participants write essays on how their past behaviors have impacted family and the community. They complete community service with a goal of repairing damages caused, as some examples. What we do have in the front end is we have a deferred sentencing program. And most of you are familiar with that, but that is a post-plea pretrial supervision program. You know, if completed successfully, those individuals will receive a non-custodial sentence. Within the last year or so, we took advantage of having a little downtime with the pandemic, but the program has been really completely revamped and now incorporates principles of restorative justice into the process. In one of the targeted areas, we have 7 targeted areas: cognition, substance abuse, pro-social networking, employment, education, stable housing, and financial literacy. Some of these are combined. I'm not great at math, but can count. And then, but the restorative justice piece is making amends. So that's the add-on there. And so how does that, you know, what does that look like? In different phases, there's different requirements, but apology letters to the victims. You know, any direct contact with the victim is vetted through the U.S. Attorney's Office. Identifying the victim and impact assignments, self-reflection assignments. We did making amends group exercise with our DSP team and the participants, and we utilized the victim facility to come in and really art through healing through art. Sadly, my art seemed to hurt others, but for others, it was really a positive experience and generated a lot of good conversations when folks were actually painting pictures and what have you. So it was a powerful experience, and one I hope we will duplicate down the road. And how things are determined within our team is, you know, our team is made up of 2 probation officers. We have an expert consultant that we contract with, Dr. Robert Kincher, and then Chief Judge McConnell. And so that team determines, you know, how many elements of restorative justice are focused on at any given time. And then some newer elements that are coming in that you heard referenced, and it's through cooperation and with the District of Massachusetts, is taking advantage of the Wyatt pilot program. And I think we do have one individual that just went through that program or is involved in that program, and another one on deck. And then also the privately organized contractor. I believe Judge Smith has an individual that is going to participate in that element. But I want to pause there and just kind of open it up to either Judge McElroy or Maria or Judge Smith about those programs, because I'm not as familiar with them. And I think this relationship is relatively new. We're just starting.
I think Judge Smith, if he's still on here, is probably best positioned to answer questions. There you are. about these programs. So I'll leave it to him.
Yeah, well, I don't have too much to say. I think I would just say that, you know, we, as John just said, I think we've got a few components, few of the concepts of restorative justice and some in our Hope Court and our DSP. But it's really, we're sort of beginning to just kind of feel our way into a more, the possibility of a more robust use of restorative justice. And I think John referred to one defendant who I just met with him yesterday, in fact, and he's going to be referred to your team to see if you'll take him on as a client. And he's very enthusiastic about the possibility of participating. So I think we have, and we're in discussion with at least one other. So I think we have a kind of burgeoning interest with respect to individual defendants who seem to be a potential fit for a full, more robust program. I don't know that we would ever have, critical mass, but I think that's something that Judge Sorokin and I and the committee that Chief Judge Barron put together will be sort of exploring how the smaller districts can take advantage of these types of programs where they might not have the numbers and the budgets to do what District of Massachusetts has done. So that's kind of, I think that's where we are, and I don't have much more to add than that. Maybe we open it up to I'm not sure what the structure of it is, John, but you can open it up.
Yeah, no, that's really kind of next is to just taking advantage of having, again, some experts with us, is to talk about it from our respective or ask questions from our respective positions about, what concerns you might have, what some areas you want to learn more about, or what are your hopes? I will start with that because just having the mic, which you guys will learn not to do going forward. But, some of the concerns I had, and I'm learning more about it, but just being that small district, and what does it take to run your own program, and what are the time commitments for probation staff? When do we involve the court and the participants? Again, how many hours of training do they need to go through? It's voluntary, is it mandatory? And then what are the financial costs? And there's a way to
Can I jump in on that, John?
Yeah, please.
So I think it's a great question, and it's one we've spent a lot of time over the last 7 years thinking about in different ways. And I would suggest a couple different sort of answers to that. One thing that I think your district can do, which you've already started to do, is if we're doing something at Wyatt, you could, if there's room, you can slide in people from the District of Rhode Island into that. And you know more about this than me, but I know probation offices in different districts have way of like reimbursing or crediting each other in some budget process for like courtesy supervision and things. And I think you could deal with it in that way. And then you don't have to create a program, but you get the benefit. I think a second way to do it is what we have one of the things you can see is we started out with Maria and Janet co-facilitating the restorative justice circles, and Maria doing the parts 1 and the later parts. And then we got too big for that. There wasn't enough, Maria didn't have enough time, and we don't have enough of a budget. For some reason, there's all these people in Washington who won't give us more money. And so what we got was support from the Federal Defender Office, and particularly the U.S. Attorney's Office. And so that's how Jamie and Eliana and Jane, they're spending some of their time, and they trained up to become facilitators, and then they've taken on Maria's role in some. So that's one way to do it. But another way that is like with individual facilitators, and this could work, I think, I don't want to speak for Janet, but I know we're not the only thing Janet does with restorative justice. She did it before us, and she does it elsewhere. But either probation through its own funds can contract, or a CJ lawyer could apply for expert funds And I had a CJ lawyer apply for extra funds. I think it was $8,000. And that was a roughly equivalent, I think, program to what we're doing in our core program. And it was for one defendant, but there's no reason 6 or 8 or 10 couldn't have done that. So I think there are ways like that, so that, because I think you're right to worry about, you can't just create a big program, especially in a small district. And those are different sort of pathways to do that, or contract with a, in one form or another. That's my answer to how I think it doesn't answer all of you asked some questions about selection and mandatory. Those are different issues, but in terms of resources, which is the big question, I think those are pathways to do that.
And I guess I would just jump in and add to, at its best, restorative justice is community driven, it's community led and community based. And so, our process has been one where we tried to start there, but we just couldn't. And so we created our own. And I think the beauty of where we are now is that we do have a model that works. And of course, it can be tweaked and it can be adjusted to sort of different areas' needs. But this is a model that you can pick up, and a competent restorative justice community-based agency could very easily sort of run our program, as long as they're sort of, skilled in restorative justice and practices. And I'm sure there are plenty in your district too. We're planning on using Second Chance Act funds to be able to sort of support that. And you could have a court family member, probation, U.S. Attorney's Office, or someone from the Federal Defender's Office who has some familiarity with restorative justice in the program, sort of oversee it as a community-based agency sort of does the actual one-on-one work. I think that too is a model that makes sense and that is replicable. Connecticut hopefully will be moving in that direction. We've assisted them in getting them up and running, and they've run one circle cohort. The person that's the lead in the District of Connecticut is someone from their Federal Defender's Office. And so yes, it is a big feat, but I think it's definitely possible. I think sort of as we continue to discuss, there's certainly the possibility of having like a regional RJ team, so I think the possibilities are endless as the interest continues to increase.
We have a question. Stacy, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yes, thank you. I had a couple of questions to ask about the program. Judge Smith indicated that what we're going to try to do is to not pilot it, but just to look for some folks that could be involved in the program, and to determine whether or not there's someone that is a potential good fit for the program. And I'm not sure whether we'll get direction as far as what criteria we should be looking at for individuals to get in the program. Are we focusing on specific identifiable types of crimes, individuals with a type of past record, not too long, individuals who have had a number of convictions? So that's kind of my first part. And then I have some questions really for the U.S. attorney who had spoken as well.
I think, Maria, that might be better for you than me.
Yeah. So our criteria is a bit, I would say, loose. However, we're not working with cases that are considered sex offender cases or sex-related crimes, not because RJ is not appropriate in those cases, but just because of resource issues. Also, if folks are struggling with acute mental health issues, acute and imminent substance use issues, we want them to resolve those issues first, or get some supports around that first prior to doing some RJ, right? If someone's homeless, actively using, not connected to community services, it doesn't quite make the right sense to have them do RJ now. We want them to sort of be in a place that's a little bit more stable. Certainly for our population, that is difficult. So we try to work with folks as much as possible. Thereafter, if folks have a willingness and an openness to participate or a curiosity, but that's really not a requirement. We've met with and worked with a number of folks that have said things like, I'm just doing this because my attorney told me to. And in fact, they've made some significant progress. it makes sense to have sort of high dollars and high resources matched with folks that are higher risk. So that too is something that we think about. But for that, we did start our program focusing on people that were post-plea pre-sentence. So if you're thinking of sort of places to start, that may make sense. However, as I mentioned, we have had plenty of clients pre-plea participate, and in the post-conviction while on supervision also participate now. So that may be something that if your district wants to think about focusing on a particular clientele area, but really the big two main issues are that for folks to be stable, and right now we're not taking any sex-related offenses.
And we have found, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Maria, that we initially started with people in the front who were on release. That's who it was almost only people on release because they were in our front end program.
Correct.
And then about a little more than a year ago, we offered it at Wyatt, and we've had on this pilot basis. And it sort of seems like that the interest level at Wyatt has been tremendous, and that the feedback, at least I hear from Maria and the others who've been in the circles, is had a tremendous effect. And there seems to be a lot of interest. So I think that's sort of a different cohort than the people who are on release, but different profile, and in terms of the factors you identify. So it seems to make sense to me that they'd be a good population to work with. You also had questions for Eliana, I think.
I did, and maybe it's already been answered, but as far as has the U.S. Attorney's Office objected to any cases? Or I know that you said you've been very, I guess, inclusive, and that you certainly feel that this program has value. So it may be that you haven't, but I was just wondering if there's an objection by a victim and you're bringing that forward on behalf of the victim. You might not have a strong objection to it, but how is that received and resolved? This seems to be a team approach, and I was just curious as to how objections by a victim were treated.
Sure. So we've had historically two kind of pipelines for these restorative justice cases. One pipeline has been the RISE program, which is kind of a diversion program where people plead guilty, but then their sentencing is postponed for 1 year while they complete this intensive probation program, complete restorative justice as part of that, and then there frequently is a sentencing benefit given at the end of that period. So for those individuals, there's a committee that includes a representative from the U.S. Attorney's Office on that committee. And my understanding, I'm not on the committee, but my understanding is they operate kind of by consensus. My understanding is there have been cases where there was a strong objection by somebody in the committee, and that has historically been respected if there was somebody who had a strong objection. Separately, there's recently been cases coming through where somebody will individually move before a judge for an order that they'd be able to participate in the restorative justice program. They would not be in the RISE program because otherwise they would be in RJ. And in that type of circumstance, it would be like any other motion before the court. If the AUSA would receive the motion, presumably they would talk to the victim. If there is an identifiable one, if they had an objection, they would present that to the judge.
I echo that. Let me add two little caveats. I'm on the RISE committee, and in the RISE committee, when we formed it way back when, the court declined to give the government a formal veto. So the government doesn't have the right, sort of in the memorandum of understanding, to say that person's out. But what we've done, you pretty much got it. We operate pretty much by consensus. So I'd say the government has what's called a strong objection that they voice, and we've never taken anyone over in the RISE program over a strong objection. Well, really, the committee's never recommended anyone to the judge. In the end, it's the judge's individual decision. But we've never recommended anyone over the government's strong objection, and I'm not aware of any judge accepting someone into RISE. In the end, it's the individual judge's decision over again adverse to the recommendation of the committee. There's also the Wyatt pipeline, sort of in addition to the one-offs through the pilot. And we don't really, part of the pilot is figuring out honestly how to do the selection process. When we created the pilot, we didn't have a selection process. It just put it out there and see what happens. And so there are a couple people I think the government has voiced through to probation in the Y process a strong objection to. And in the pilot, we've taken the position that we're not going to take someone who there's a strong objection to, because we're trying to figure this all out. We want to do it. We want to get everybody on board. We want to make sure, like, how should, and we're having discussions about how should we do this? Like, how, if there's 10 spots, how should we allocate them if there's more than 10 people? So it's that, and part of it is the very issue you raise.
Could I just follow up on that point? Because I think one of the things that we're sort of struggling with as we look at individual cases is how does the restorative justice component sort of fit into the incarceration question? So you have some cases where it seems kind of easy if they complete restorative justice, kind of like our DSP program. If they complete the program over the course of the year, you feel pretty comfortable about giving a non-incarcerated sentence. Then you have others who you're really not so confident that you want to go to a non-incarcerated sentence. So the question in my mind is, well, does it make sense to do restorative justice for a year and then send somebody to prison for a couple of years? Or does it make sense to send them to prison for a couple of years and do restorative justice as a supervised release condition? Or does it make sense to hope that you could get a program at Wyatt and keep them, work off some of their time and do restorative justice at the same time? And none of those seems perfect to me, but I'm wondering if you have any experience on kind of which of those things seems to make the most sense.
There's no perfect answer. I think my perspective on this is this: you have two groups at the beginning after an arrest, those who are detained and those who are released. For those who are released, I think it's a general proposition. It makes sense to do it at the early. That's the time to, that's a really good time to do it. It's fresh, it's close in time, and people are motivated. I also think it makes sense. I have recommended in individual cases the Bureau of Prisons do it. I've never heard back from them. I'm not sure it's happening, but I think that it would be sensible to do it there and at all 3 points. But I think it makes a lot of sense there. But you hit upon the issue, then what happens is we don't promise anything for our RISE program or restorative justice, except that we'll consider all the facts, and everyone weighs them individually and weighs it in the case. But in the easy case where the person probably wouldn't get, or was a very short incarcerated sentence, they did really well and they look really good and everything's turned around, and there might be sort of a consensus view that to give the person a variance or departure and non-incarcerated. But somebody else, there could be differing views, and it can be, and you have two issues. It can be, first of all, hard to weigh it. How much significance and weight should you give it to it? And I tell people, I don't care what someone did in the circle. We don't get a report about that. And that doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is, what do I see in your behavior and in your words and your deeds, that, that's what's I'm looking at, and that's what's important. But it's hard because it's hard to take a person who's in the community, who's doing really well, and then it's always difficult to take them out of the community and remand them to custody in the pretrial example you give. And that's a given. And I don't have a perfect great answer to that, other than I do think it makes sense to do it I think that doing it at the beginning is a good time to do it. And it would be not a sensible reason to not do it just because we don't want to confront what is a hard decision. And for people in custody, the harder part for them, I think it makes a lot of sense if they're detained to do it. We've gotten a lot of positive feedback so far from the cohort, so people who've done it. And I think the harder part is, how do you evaluate it? Like, how do you measure its significance at sentencing? Because for people in custody, there's sort of less opportunity for them to show you in their words and deeds how they've changed. Although I just read a letter that was filed before one of my colleagues from a correction officer at Wyatt, and commenting on a defendant who was up for sentencing, that he had intervened at post RJ. He intervened in an altercation between an inmate and a correction officer, and they were very appreciative that he'd done that, and it was very helpful to them. So, that's there. Even in custody, which is more limited, there are circumstances. So, I come down on the side, do it early, do it often, do it before sentencing, which isn't to say don't do it after, but and then just grapple with what to do with it.
Judge, we have a few more minutes left, but there's a question for JC. One of the participants on the call, JC, wants to know if you have an opinion on when you think it would be participation would be most beneficial.
I think it would be most beneficial as soon as possible. Like Mr. Judge Sorokin said, like once you know you want to change, it's best to attack that situation and identify it right then and there. Some people are going to take longer. For me, it was when I got released that time that I knew that I had to change. Like, this can't be me. So I think,
Go ahead.
I think it's identifying it as soon as possible, that you sit down with that person and you have a conversation, within the first 10 seconds that he really wants to do this.
I think there's another dimension. I think, and I agree with what JC had to say, but there was a guy who spoke at a panel like this a number of years ago. He was one of our early participants in the RISE program. And he got arrested in a federal case. He went to inpatient drug treatment. He did that. When he came out, his lawyer told him about this RISE program. And he said, okay, I'll do it. Why not? It's something else. It'll delay my sentencing. It'll put off a judgment day. So why not? He wasn't like, he wouldn't have described himself, I don't think, as ready, sort of primed for change. He went into the circle and he was sitting next to Jamie Herbert, who's a AUSA in Boston. And I think his first reaction, not Jamie's, but this other person's first reaction was, whoa, what am I doing here next to a federal prosecutor? What's that guy doing here? That's pretty fair, I think, Jamie. And so he said, I was a criminal. He describes himself as a criminal, a drug dealer, and a drug addict, like my father and my grandfather before me. And I was that way when I got arrested, and I was that way when I came out of drug treatment. I was sober, but I was the same. And it wasn't until partway through that circle that I began to change. So he was someone who I think was, maybe not dragged to the process, but he was at least pushed into it. And so I think that, I think it has an effect on people, even if they weren't primed before they went.
Hello?
Yeah. Still there, JC? Yep.
And another thing that really caught me was told that you're not getting offered anything. This got to come from you. Like, that was, I think it was Jamie's first words was, you're not offered anything for this. So that even made me want to change more, because at the end of the day, if I go back or whatever, I identified what was going on in my life.
Yeah. And I just wanted to say about the young man that Judge Sorokin was talking about. I just remember so clearly when we did some work in the workshop about, is there somebody you might want to do a restorative process with, someone that you caused harm to? And I just remember so clearly, he said, I want to do this with my son. I want my son to know who his father was, who his grandfather was, who his uncles were, and I want him to know that he and I are going to stop it.
You like this because it's done.
And he talks about how his son is the first person is the fourth generation and the first one who's not a drug addict or a criminal, and how meaningful this process is what led that to change, and how he's not that anymore either. He's just a different person. So do we have time for any more questions, Nora? Are we done?
We're at the end of our time here, Judge, but everybody has Rana's email address. If there are any further questions, I'll be sure to forward them to the team, and I really appreciate your participation here today.
Well,
thank you for coming.
Thank you to everyone.
Thanks a lot for doing this, to the whole team. This is really is helpful to our whole board. So really appreciate you all taking the time to do it. I mean, you can tell from the turnout how much interest there is.
Yeah.